He was married to his ambition long before he ever touched my hand, and I should have known that no matter how tightly he held me at night, there would always be something he loved more than the warmth of my skin. I met him in a room filled with glass walls and city lights, where everyone spoke about numbers and expansion and futures that smelled like steel and strategy. He stood at the center of it all, controlled and sharp, his presence heavy without being loud. There was something magnetic about him, not softness, not warmth, but direction. He moved like a man who had already decided where he was going and didn't need permission from anyone to get there. When he looked at me for the first time, it wasn't curiosity in his eyes, it was assessment. And somehow that made it worse. I felt seen, but not in the gentle way. I felt measured, calculated, chosen with intention. If you are drawn to intense, dark love stories about ambition, obsession, and emotional power, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Our conversations were slow burns, late-night messages about risk and fear, and the cost of wanting more from life than what you were handed. He told me he didn't believe in balance. Balance is for people who are afraid to go all in, he said once, his voice low as we stood too close on his balcony, the city humming beneath us. You either sacrifice everything for what you want, or you settle. I should have realized then that he wasn't talking about love. He was talking about conquest. And I was just another territory he hadn't decided whether to claim or leave untouched. When we finally crossed the line from conversation to something more, it wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was intense and consuming, and built on tension that had been tightening for weeks. Being with him felt like standing too close to fire, dangerous, thrilling, impossible to walk away from without feeling the loss of heat. He kissed like a man who didn't do anything halfway. He held me like possession came naturally to him. But even in those moments, even when his breath was against my neck and his hands traced promises down my spine, I felt it. The distance. The part of him that never fully arrived. He was present physically, emotionally sharp, but his mind was always calculating the next move, the next deal, the next victory. I began rearranging my life around his schedule. Dinners were canceled because meetings ran late. Weekends disappeared into business trips that sounded glamorous but felt lonely. I told myself this was temporary, that once he built what he was chasing, he would slow down. That once he felt secure enough, he would choose me with the same ferocity he chose success. But ambition doesn't rest. It feeds. And I slowly realized I was competing with something that didn't sleep. The nights he did come over were intoxicating. He would arrive past midnight. Place he could unravel without losing place, he could unravel without losing control. And I let him. I let him use my silence as comfort, my body as grounding, my presence as relief from the war he was constantly fighting in boardrooms and negotiations. He would whisper that I was the only thing that made sense in his chaos, that I steadied him, that without me, he would lose himself in the climb. But when morning came, he was already half gone, phone buzzing, mind elsewhere, ambition wrapping around him tighter than my arms ever could. I started noticing the pattern. He loved me most when he was exhausted, when he needed something, when he was vulnerable in the dark. But in daylight, in public, in conversations about the future, I became optional. He spoke about expansion, about moving to other cities, about building empires that required sacrifices. And whenever I asked where I fit into that vision, he would kiss my forehead and say, "You know I care about you." Care, not promise, not partnership. Care felt small against the magnitude of what I wanted. I didn't want to be his escape. I wanted to be his equal. But loving a man consumed by ambition is like loving a storm. You can admire its power, you can feel its intensity, but you will never control where it lands. I began dressing sharper, speaking smarter, trying to match his energy so he would see me not just as comfort, but as asset. I stepped into his world of strategy and cold decisions, thinking if I proved I understood it, he would finally make space for me inside it. And for a while, it worked. He introduced me to colleagues. He let me sit beside him at events. His hand would rest possessively at my waist, subtle but claiming. Yet even then, I felt like a beautiful addition to a life already in motion, not the reason it moved. The darker truth crept in slowly. He didn't know how to love something that didn't serve his ascent. Every relationship he had ever described ended the same way, 7:59 p.m., March 3rd, 2026. They couldn't handle my drive. He wore it like a badge of honor, like emotional casualties were proof of dedication. And I started to fear I was becoming another story he would tell one day, another woman who simply couldn't handle it. But it wasn't that I couldn't handle it. It was that I was disappearing inside it. There were nights I lay awake beside him while he slept, watching the sharp lines of his face soften in rest, wondering if this was enough for me, being the secret softness behind a man building an empire. Wondering if passion was supposed to feel this unstable. He once told me, almost casually, "If I ever have to choose between love and success, I won't hesitate." He didn't look at me when he said it. Maybe he didn't have to. The message was clear. And still I stayed. Because loving him felt like addiction. Because the way he touched me made the rest of the world blur. Because when he looked at me with that rare, unguarded hunger, I felt irreplaceable. But addiction is not devotion, and intensity is not commitment. I began to see that I was giving him something raw and real while he gave me fragments between meetings. I was building dreams in my head while he was building towers in reality. And the higher he climbed, the smaller I felt beneath him. The breaking point didn't come with betrayal. It came with absence. Weeks passed where his texts grew shorter, his visits rarer. He was closing a deal that would change everything. "Just a little longer," he kept saying. "After this, I'll have time." But ambition doesn't have an after. There is always another summit. And one night, sitting alone in my apartment, staring at a phone that hadn't lit up in hours, I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. I was in love with a man who would never prioritize me. Not because I wasn't enough, but because nothing would ever be enough compared to the empire he was building in his mind. And loving him meant accepting second place forever. 8:00 p.m., March 3rd, 2026. The realization did not shatter me immediately. It hollowed me out slowly, like water carving through stone, patient and relentless, until I could no longer pretend that I was satisfied with fragments. I stopped waiting for his calls first. I stopped rearranging my evenings around the possibility of him appearing at my door past midnight with tired eyes and hungry hands. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, curious to see whether he would notice the space where I used to stand so faithfully. At first, he didn't. His world was exploding in the best way. Contracts signed, interviews scheduled, expansion plans moving forward. I saw his face online more than I saw it in person, sharp and composed, speaking about vision and sacrifice like they were sacred vows. And in a way, they were. He had pledged himself to ambition long before he ever whispered my name in the dark. When he finally did notice my distance, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't a soft conversation about feelings. It was control disguised as concern. "You've been quiet," he said one night, standing in my apartment like he still owned the air inside it. His eyes scanned me carefully, as if trying to calculate whether I was slipping beyond his reach. I met his gaze without lowering mine for the first time. "I've been busy," I replied calmly, using the same tone he had used on me for months. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe even fear. He stepped closer, his presence still intoxicating, still powerful. But I no longer felt small beneath it. "Don't play games with me," he murmured. "You know what we have." That was the problem. I did know. We had intensity without security, passion without promise, nights that felt infinite and days that felt optional. "What do we have?" I asked quietly, and the question hung between us heavier than any accusation. He didn't answer immediately. For a man who always had strategies prepared, this time he was unarmed. "We have something real," he said finally. Real. The same vague word he hid behind whenever clarity threatened him. I felt something inside me settle, not break, not explode, just settle into certainty. Real isn't the same as lasting, I said. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through his composure. Why does everything have to be defined right now? You know what I'm building. You know what this year means for me. There it was again. The hierarchy. His dreams at the top. Us somewhere beneath. Flexible and adjustable. I stepped back, creating physical space to match the emotional one I had been building for weeks. And what does this mean for me? I asked. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. That was the moment I understood the full truth. Not that he didn't care, but that he didn't think in terms of us. His life was structured around personal ascent. Love to him was a luxury accessory. Beautiful, enjoyable, replaceable if necessary. The
argument that followed wasn't loud, it was sharp and controlled, like everything about him. He insisted I knew who he was from the beginning, that he had never promised me forever, and he was right. He hadn't. I had filled in those blanks myself, mistaking chemistry for commitment, mistaking exclusivity for intention. I never asked you to wait for me, he said coldly. The words sliced deeper than shouting ever could. Because he was right again, I had volunteered. I had stood patiently beside a man climbing a mountain that didn't have space for two. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. You didn't ask, I agreed softly, but you let me. Silence swallowed the room. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure. Not weak, never weak, but uncertain in a way ambition had never made him. What are you saying? He asked. I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every night, every postponed plan, every half-finished future pressing against my ribs. I'm saying I won't compete with your ambition anymore. The words felt terrifying and liberating all at once. His jaw tightened. This isn't competition. It is, I replied, and I'm losing. That hit him. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened. He stepped toward me again, softer this time, hands reaching as if to pull me back into the familiar gravity of him. You're not losing. You're with me. And there it was, the mindset that had defined everything. Being with him was supposed to be enough. Existing in the shadow of his empire should have felt like privilege. But I didn't want to be chosen only when convenient. I didn't want to be the quiet reward he returned to after conquering the world. I wanted to build something side by side, not trail behind him like a beautiful afterthought. I don't want to be with you like this, I whispered. He searched my face as if looking for hesitation, for weakness he could persuade away. You love me, he said, almost as a challenge. I do, I admitted. But love isn't supposed to feel like waiting for permission to matter. The truth hung between us, undeniable and brutal. For a second, I thought he might fight for me, that he might finally choose something other than the climb. His hands hovered at my waist, his forehead resting briefly against mine, and I felt the old pull, the heat, the hunger, the intoxicating familiarity. Don't do this, he murmured, not because he was ready to change, but because he was uncomfortable losing control. And that was the final shift. I realized he wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing access to me. There is a difference. I stepped back fully this time, breaking the contact that had once felt like oxygen. I hope you build everything you're chasing, I said quietly. I just won't be standing at the finish line anymore. He didn't beg. That wasn't who he was. He straightened, composure snapping back into place like armor. You'll regret walking away, he said evenly. No one will ever want you the way I do. For a split second, the old insecurity flared, the fear that he was right, that no one would ever look at me with that consuming intensity again. But intensity had burned me more than it had warmed me. I don't need to be wanted like that, I replied steadily. I need to be chosen. And with that, I opened the door. He hesitated only briefly before walking out, footsteps controlled, back straight, pride intact. He didn't look back. I closed the door softly behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. The first few days were brutal, not because I doubted the decision, but because my body still craved the chaos of him. I missed the adrenaline of our nights, the way his voice dropped when he wanted me close, the way he could command a room and then unravel only for me. But slowly, the craving transformed into clarity. I began to see how much of myself I had minimized to fit inside his world, how often I had swallowed needs to avoid being labeled a distraction, how frequently I had mistaken dominance for devotion. Weeks later, I saw a headline about him, another expansion, another milestone. His success was undeniable, and for the first time, it didn't sting. I understood something essential. Loving a powerful man is not the same as being empowered by him. Power shared feels different than power admired from a distance. I no longer wanted to orbit someone else's ambition. I wanted my own center of gravity. Months passed, and the ache softened into memory. I built routines that didn't revolve around waiting. I rediscovered passions that had nothing to do with being impressive enough to stand beside him. And one quiet evening, sitting alone with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years, I realized the irony of it all. He had taught me ambition, just not in the way he intended. He had shown me what relentless pursuit looked like, and now I was turning that same intensity inward, building a life where I would never again accept being second place to someone else's dream. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel powerful and invisible at the same time, then you understand this kind of silence. So before this story ends, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this are not just about heartbreak, they are about awakening. If he was married to his ambition, then I was finally committed to myself, and that was a vow no one could overshadow.